At the end of the Second World War, there were a series of executions of Nazi war criminals that captivated the world. The remaining members of Hitler's hierarchy in Nazi government were paraded in front of the world's cameras, and the Nuremberg Trials took place with hours of testimony describing the evils of the Third Reich. There were many accusations levelled at the defendants, including crimes against humanity, and their roles in the exterminations that occurred inside of the concentration camps, but 11 men were condemned to death for their involvement in the Nazi regime. One of these, the most senior, would evade the hangman's noose, escaping his execution the night before his date with destiny was about to happen. But many of these men had been responsible for the war, or the suffering of millions of people. But a couple went to their death still devoted to the Nazi way of life, and some shocked the witnesses by what they said. This is a complete story of the executions of those men who were condemned following the Nuremberg trial. Join us as we look at the background and the story of each of the condemned defendants' execution in detail. Remember to support our channel as always. Please make sure to subscribe.
Joachim von Ribbentrop was born in 1893 in Prussia, and as a child he was described by his teacher as the most stupid in his class, full of vanity and very pushy. His father was dismissed from the Prussian army after discussing rumours about Kaiser Wilhelm II, and because of this the family were rather poor. They then moved to Switzerland, but Joachim was taught by different tutors of different languages, and he even travelled to Britain for a year to improve his use of English. In 1911 he began working as a clerk for a German importing company based in London, and he then moved to Canada, being employed in various construction roles. As the First World War broke out, he returned to Germany and joined the German army. He saw action on the Eastern Front before going to the Western Front, and during his time in the army he was given the Iron Cross. After the war he met his wife and had 5 children. After he left the army, he worked as a salesman for the French champagne business Pommery in the Rhineland, and it was through this that he met Adolf Hitler for the first time. Von Ribbentrop was introduced to Hitler as a man who would get the same price for German champagne as others would get for the French champagne, and he was described as an astute businessman. He was bowled over by Hitler's presence, and he joined the Nazi Party officially on the 1st of May 1932, beginning his political career. He had a fear of communism and believed that the Nazis were the way to combat this. Ribbentrop was a man who was not trusted by the older members of the party, and he was disliked, but Hitler was fond of him and he would make time for him any time. Ribbentrop's political beliefs prior to joining the Nazi Party are questionable, as he was described as a man who had no political views, however did admire the recovery efforts of Gustav Stresemann, and he may have wanted to see the Kaiser return. Many who knew him would later be shocked at his link to the anti-Semitic Nazi Party, as before he showed no views that were anti-Jewish. He became a favourite of Hitler and a trusted advisor on foreign policy, but it was said that he didn't know anything about it, instead just wished to please Hitler. He was a bit of a yes-man, who would listen to Hitler and then tell him exactly what he wanted to hear. He arranged meetings with journalists and Hitler that would promote the future dictator's image. Ribbentrop quickly rose throughout the foreign ministry, to the point where he had a staff of around 300 people, and in August 1936 he became the ambassador to London. In this role he was tasked with keeping the British government sweet and convincing them not to become involved in German affairs, and in particular their disputes with regards to borders and territory. There was also an olive branch extended between the nations to work together against communism and the Soviet Union. He was famously known for making an embarrassing gaffe, greeting King George VI with a German Nazi salute, nearly knocking over the king. He also had SS guards stationed outside the German embassy in London, and had official cars flying swastikas, which caused a great degree of outrage in Britain. On the 4th of February 1938, he became Germany's foreign minister, replacing Konstantin von Neurath. He was described at the time by Hitler's secretary as a rather odd man, absent-minded and a cranky eccentric, but he worked closely with the Führer, negotiating with the French and British governments. It was looking likely that as Hitler's demands for land across Europe for his Reich increased, war would possibly be on the horizon. It was Ribbentrop's job to help keep the country sweet and to help get deals with territory, and he in August 1939 signed his most famous pact, the Nazi-Soviet Pact, or the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. He had managed to obtain the Sudetenland for the Nazis, and this did not stop Hitler taking the rest of Czechoslovakia. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a non-aggression pact between the surprising allies of the Soviet Union and the Nazis to guarantee peace. The agreement also organised the partition of Poland and how it would be split up between the two, and it should have been a pact that guaranteed 10 years of peace, but this would not last long. The deal that would carry his name was something Ribbentrop himself was very proud of. Within a year of signing, Hitler began to once again plot the invasion of the Soviet Union. He then sent his foreign minister to sign a new treaty and agreement with Japan to secure a further ally. In late September 1940, Ribbentrop informed the Soviet minister Molotov that Germany, Italy and Japan were forming an Axis alliance to be against the US and not the Soviets. As the Second World War erupted, he had a key role in dividing up and organising the annexation of many of the Balkan states into the Third Reich, and he helped to establish pro-Nazi states within these, for example choosing a Ustasha to rule over Croatia. Ribbentrop himself was opposed to Operation Barbarossa, but he and the Foreign Office began to develop a tense relationship with the SS. With regards to the Holocaust, the Foreign Office played an important role in organising the deportation of the Jews to the death camps. Ribbentrop passed a book with the Holocaust work, and ordered those below him to deal with it, but only once did he try and slow down deportations. He kept meeting with different foreign ministers as the Second World War continued, through to 1943, and he continued to work with the Nazi policies put in place. In particular, in April 1943, he met with the regent of Hungary and tried to convince him to deport all of Hungary's Jewish population straight to the death camps, and allegedly during the meeting showed his true colours, saying, "The Jews must be exterminated or taken to concentration camps. There is no other possibility." As the Second World War entered 1944, Ribbentrop's influence across Germany fell. As most of the world was at war with Germany, no one needed to meet with him or negotiate, as the focus came to defeating the Germans. Diplomatic relations that existed between Germany and many other countries across the world were now severed, and Hitler began to avoid his foreign minister, and he grew bored of him. Ribbentrop also at the time started conflict with other Nazis, but during the July 20th plot, much scrutiny was placed upon him. Many members of staff within the foreign ministry took part in the plan to blow up Hitler's Wolf's Lair or Rastenburg and kill Hitler, but Ribbentrop knew nothing about it. He did later work closely with the SS to punish those involved. However, Göring became furious at him, screaming that he was a dirty little champagne salesman. But as the Battle of Berlin took hold and the Red Army conquered large swathes of the city, Hitler took the easy way out inside his bunker, taking his own life. Von Ribbentrop tried to find a job under the new government, headed up by President Karl Dönitz, but he was rejected, and he then went into hiding under a false name, Herr Reiser. He stayed in Hamburg, and then after the Germans surrendered, he was arrested. He was seized by a French citizen, who was working for the British, and on his person was found a letter to Churchill, rambling about British foreign policy. He was then kept imprisoned until he was placed on trial at the Nuremberg Trials. After the Second World War, the remaining high-ranking members of the Nazi Party, including Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess and Ribbentrop, were placed on trial at Nuremberg, with the world keen to bring them to justice for their crimes of the conflict. Ribbentrop was to stand trial accused of 4 crimes: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and deliberately planning and waging a war of aggression. Ribbentrop was found to have been involved in the organisation of the final solution, working out mass deportations within the Foreign Office, and also he ordered that the process of sending Jews to the death camps needed to be sped up. He also carried out other crimes and was held accountable for other atrocities that occurred during World War II. In his defence, Ribbentrop stated it wasn't him who made the big decisions, instead Hitler would do this and he had no choice. He also said that Hitler had deceived him with his initial views on peace, but this was clearly a lie. It was obvious that Joachim von Ribbentrop was close to the war effort and also the planning, and was integral with this as he was the foreign minister. He remained loyal to Hitler until the end, in prison saying, With all I know, if in this cell Hitler should come to me and say do this, I would still do it. He claimed at trial that he'd worked for 20 years of his life for an understanding between Germany, France and Britain, and wished to build an alliance between Germany and Britain, but this could not be achieved. For his crimes, Ribbentrop was sentenced to death. He was one of 10 men sentenced to death by the judges at the trial, including Hermann Göring. However, the former head of the Luftwaffe would escape his execution by taking his own life hours before. One of the key points about the Nuremberg executions is that they were not as clean as many thought, and they were botched by the infamous US executioner John C. Woods. Woods has gone down in history as being a man who did not perform his duty to the best of his ability that day when executing some of history's worst war criminals. Ribbentrop was the first of the men to be executed. Inside the gymnasium of the prison the condemned defendants were held in, a large scaffold had been created. Hitler's foreign minister made his way to the gallows first. He entered the gymnasium and climbed up the stairs of the gallows. He climbed the 14 steps escorted by the guards, and he was then asked for any final words. As a black hood was placed on his head, he stated, "God protect Germany. God have mercy on my soul. My final wish is that Germany should recover her unity, and that, for the sake of peace, there should be an understanding between East and West. I wish peace to the world." Ribbentrop then turned to the prison's priest who accompanied him and whispered to him, "I'll see you again." As the trapdoor fell open, von Ribbentrop, the man who was once the key foreign minister for the Third Reich, was left swinging from the noose for a long 14 minutes. It took him almost a quarter of an hour to die, writhing around and moaning in pain, as the drop had not been calculated correctly. Because of this, von Ribbentrop's spinal cord had not been severed, and instead he slowly strangled to death. Joachim von Ribbentrop was the champagne salesman who managed to charm Adolf Hitler, to the point where he rose incredibly sharply to the position of foreign minister. With Hitler's key ideas to expand the German Empire, Ribbentrop possibly had one of the most difficult and important roles in the whole of the Nazi hierarchy. He was a man who at times may not have wanted war with certain countries. However, ultimately he was a man who became ingrained with the horrific Nazi policies that brought so much suffering onto those across Europe. Von Ribbentrop is an interesting and divisive figure, who today is mostly associated with his actions pre-war, negotiating with different nations. He was a man who was devoted to Hitler, but by the end of the Second World War, Adolf Hitler had become tired of him. After the conflict, it was confirmed that he had a role in the Holocaust, and that Ribbentrop was responsible in the planning and waging of a war that killed millions across Europe.
Wilhelm Keitel was born to rather humble beginnings. His father was a middle-class landowner and farmer who owned a significant amount of land within the Duchy of Brunswick. After completing his education, Keitel wished to take over his family's lands. However, his father refused to retire and hand over control, and because of this, Wilhelm began to seek a career inside of the military. He began this in 1901 and entered as a cadet officer inside of the Prussian army. He was refused permission to join the cavalry as he was seen as a commoner, and then he joined the Field Artillery Regiment. Now, as the First World War broke out, he was pressed into service fighting in the depths of Flanders on the Western Front, inside of the trenches. However, in September 1914, he was seriously injured in the arm by a shell fragment and was forced to stay in hospital to recover. After this, he was promoted to the rank of captain, and after the war he was kept inside of the Reichswehr, the limited German army of 100,000 soldiers, as stipulated in the Treaty of Versailles. Keitel was a significant member of the Freikorps too, a right-wing paramilitary group made up of many First World War veterans. This group was seen as rather dangerous within the new Weimar Republic, and Keitel helped to organise the units, alongside continuing to rise within the Reichswehr. He became a lieutenant colonel and was placed into the Ministry of War in 1929, and was then promoted yet again. When Hitler seized control in 1933, he was acting as the head of the organisational department of the military. He was instrumental in Hitler's plans to rearm Germany and to build up the German army to the point where it could launch invasions into different lands. He helped to organise the building of tanks, the building of numbers in the army, and much more, which violated the Treaty of Versailles.
In 1935, he was recommended to the rank of a Major General and became the Chief of the Reich's Ministry of War's Armed Forces Office. Here this group oversaw the Army, Air Force and the Navy, and more promotions began. Hitler in 1938 did take control of the Wehrmacht and placed Keitel as the chief of the Oberkommando of the Wehrmacht. This in a sense made Keitel responsible as a war minister, and he was always present in cabinet meetings with Hitler. Inside of Hitler's Nazi cabinet, Keitel was seen as a yes man, and a man who whenever Hitler wanted something, Keitel would do this without any questions asked. Whenever Hitler snapped his fingers, Keitel was there, and he was seen as a stupid follower of Hitler and rather inept in his job. When Hitler became the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, and Keitel became the Chief of Staff, practically the number 2, Hitler's inner circle were rather shocked. He became known as Keitel, calling him a lackey, and he was often referred to as a popular nodding donkey toy in Germany at the time, who just nodded and had no opinion. He was a man who also had much abuse directed at him from Hitler, and the dictator of Germany once said of him, "He has the brains of a movie usher, but was made the highest ranking officer in the army because the man is as loyal as a dog." He could be seen as a nervous man, and when the Second World War broke out, it was Keitel who was placed in the forefront of the German army's attempts to conquer the majority of Europe. When Germany took over Poland and then subsequently France, Keitel said that Hitler was the greatest warlord of all time, and he himself helped to negotiate the French armistice. After this, Hitler turned his attention to the East and the Soviet Union, and began planning Operation Barbarossa, and Keitel did not object to this invasion, despite the fact it would push the German army to its limits. Keitel dismissed the problems of the invasion, and he remained in his position even after the failure of it. Hitler still maintained all overall decisions over the German military, and as the conflict went on, Keitel's influence was still rather small, with the fact he had no overall control or say. He was involved in the punishments and reprisals after the 20th of July plot, in which Adolf Hitler was injured inside the Wolf's Lair, and he helped to organise the arrest of 7,000 people and the executions of 5,000. During the Battle of Berlin, Keitel remained close to Hitler even until the very end. He remained inside of the bunker, however as the German forces quickly became overwhelmed, he fled the city after Hitler's death, and became a member of the Flensburg government, headed up by the new president Karl Dönitz. Keitel quickly tried to establish himself as a lackey for the Flensburg government, however he also signed the unconditional surrender to the Soviet Union before being arrested days later. He was brought to Nuremberg to face justice in the Nuremberg Trials, however he was known to have been involved in a number of war crimes. He had a full understanding of the invasion of Poland, and also knew of the Nazi plans to mass murder, arrest and deport the population, and he did not oppose the Einsatzgruppen's activities, murdering innocent civilians. He also issued a number of criminal orders, which allowed the execution of Jews and civilians, and these were personally signed by Keitel, and he argued that Soviet prisoners of war should not be dealt with properly, abiding by the Geneva Convention. He believed they should have been treated terribly, as he believed that it was his job to suppress Bolshevism and the Soviet way of life, and with this he ordered executions of communists. He was also a signatory to the Night and Fog Decree, which allowed foreign civilians to be taken to Germany for trial, and then subsequently deported to a concentration camp. He was also part of signing the Commando Order that allowed the killing of enemy special troops when they were captured in their uniform. Whilst at trial he was indicted on all 4 counts, and most of the prosecution against him was based on the fact he had issued these orders and signed them. He stated that he knew Hitler's ideas were illegal, however he could not oppose this and was merely following orders, which was not accepted. It was found that Keitel's crimes were so significant that the excuse of following orders could not be taken forward. The commando order was used against him, and it was said that Keitel knew if the execution of commandos to be shot dead on the spot without trial was illegal, but he still issued the order anyway. At trial he said, as these atrocities developed one from the other, step by step, without any knowledge of the consequences, destiny took its tragic course with fateful consequences. Keitel knew he was going to be executed for his crimes and was found guilty of the charges. He requested to be shot by a firing squad as a member of the military. However, this was dismissed and he was ruled to be sentenced to death by hanging, like a common criminal. The executions of those found guilty at the Nuremberg Trials occurred on the 16th of October 1946,
and 10 executions occurred in the early morning that day. Carrying out the executions was John C. Woods, a rather controversial executioner, who did not perform his office as he possibly should have done that day. The method was a standard drop method, and this often did not work as well as it should have done. It often took a lot longer for the condemned to be killed, and many strangled to death, and even smashed their heads on the trapdoor as they fell. Keitel's execution was one that did not go as smoothly as it could have, and the executions were performed in the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison, and Keitel was the second man executed that morning. He entered the room after von Ribbentrop and was the first military leader to be executed under the concept of international law, bringing professional soldiers to justice for their crimes. Keitel entered the chamber 2 minutes after von Ribbentrop had gone through the trapdoor, and his body was still seen in the room, hidden behind a curtain on the first scaffold, but the tight rope could be seen. Keitel, when he came into the room, didn't seem too tense. He held his head high, whilst his hands were being tied, and walked straight to the gallows. He replied to confirm his identity loudly, and then walked up the gallows as if he was expecting to receive a salute. He did not need any help from the guards, and then he turned to the platform to look at the crowd, and he stood there proudly. He was asked for any final words and stated, "I call on God Almighty to have mercy on the German people. More than 2 million German soldiers went to their death for the fatherland before me. I now follow my sons, all for Germany." A hood was then placed over his head, along with the noose, and he was then shuffled over the trapdoor. Keitel's uniformed body then plunged through the trapdoor, and it was said he showed a huge degree of courage facing his death. However, Keitel's execution did not go well. It allegedly took 24 minutes for Keitel to be killed, and as he fell through the trapdoor, the drop did not snap his neck, and instead he slowly strangled to death and convulsed behind the curtain, but also he hit his head on the trapdoor as he fell, and this left him bleeding profusely from his head. So Wilhelm Keitel, despite being instrumental in the German military's high command, followed in the footsteps of millions of German soldiers, dying because of their involvement in Hitler's conflicts. He was one of the most senior figures at the Nuremberg Trials, and the nail in his coffin was the fact he signed many orders and rules that violated international laws and resulted in the suffering and deaths of thousands.
Ernst Kaltenbrunner was born in Austria on the 4th of October 1903. He was part of a rather well-to-do family, with his father being a lawyer, and he was educated in Linz, where Adolf Hitler lived during his childhood. He was childhood friends with another man who would become an infamous Nazi, Adolf Eichmann, who was instrumental in implementing the final solution. Kaltenbrunner then obtained a law degree and began working in a law firm before opening his own office. He later married and had 3 children. However, on the 18th of October 1930, he joined the Nazi Party. Despite living in Austria, he joined the German Party, which would later become banned in Austria. He became a district speaker for the party and later joined the SS in late August 1931. By 1933, he was the head of the National Socialist Lawyers League in Linz, a group of pro-Nazi lawyers who would regularly meet. Kaltenbrunner was arrested for conspiracy to overthrow the Austrian government and was held in a detention camp, however led a hunger strike which forced his and almost 500 other party members to be released. He was later then jailed for high treason, but the charge was dropped again, but with this charge he was banned from practicing law. He rose throughout the SS ranks and was considered a leader of the Austrian SS. He repeatedly travelled to meet with other high-ranking SS members, such as Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, but was arrested again in 1937. In March 1938, Hitler's Nazi Germany annexed Austria into its empire and Reich, and Kaltenbrunner helped with this coup, and for this was given a role as the State Secretary for Public Security in the new government, which was controlled by Himmler. Further promotions came for him, and he helped to open up and establish Mauthausen concentration camp, the first Nazi concentration camp in Austria, and he later also became a high SS and police leader for the main SS command centre in Austria. As the Second World War broke out, he continued his work within the SS. He was placed into the Reserve Waffen-SS and began to utilise for the war effort the large intelligence network he set up in Austria during his time there. This impressed Himmler, who appointed him the chief of the Reich Security Main Office. In this role he oversaw the Gestapo, Kripo and SD, replacing the assassinated Reinhard Heydrich, and Kaltenbrunner remained in this job until the end of the conflict. He was a devoted anti-Semite and was present at a meeting in December 1940 when it was decided that all Jews who were incapable of working were to be killed and gassed. It was with Kaltenbrunner's leadership of the RSHA that the pace of the Holocaust was picked up and the extermination of the Jews was accelerated. Deportations to concentration camps were also hastened, and it was said that he wished all Jews in the Reich and the occupied countries to be liquidated. He also showed his barbarism when he pushed for a law stating that all homosexuals would be forced to undergo compulsory castration. Whilst inspecting Mauthausen in 1943, he took great interest in watching demonstrations of different methods of killing, gunshot, hanging, gassing, and 15 prisoners were selected to be killed purely to demonstrate to Kaltenbrunner. He also forced Auschwitz to take more prisoners and subsequently gassed thousands of them as soon as they got to the camp. During a meeting with a Hungarian official, it was decided that 750,000 of Hungary's Jews would be taken straight to the concentration camps and killed. Kaltenbrunner himself was a very scary man, and it was even rumoured that Heinrich Himmler was frightened of him due to his tall height, facial scars, and horrific temper. He carried out the later investigations of the July 20th plot, and it's estimated that 5,000 people were executed for the failed attempted bombing of Hitler inside the Wolf's Lair, with thousands more being deported to concentration camps. He was a virulent anti-Semite and someone who was incredibly loyal to Hitler, and he was fanatical about his Führer. As the Second World War continued throughout its final years, more celebration and accolades were placed onto Kaltenbrunner for his work. However, by 1944, it was clear that the war was only going one way for Nazi Germany, heading towards a defeat. With the Red Army closing in on the Germans, Ernst Kaltenbrunner ordered that all of the prisoners inside concentration camps were to be killed, and he had briefly been placed in charge of the remaining German forces in southern Europe by Himmler in April 1945. As Hitler made his final trip out of the Führer bunker in Berlin, Kaltenbrunner was there that day. However, he quickly realised Hitler was planning to die in his bunker, and because of this he fled Berlin. On the 12th of May 1945, he was captured along with some SS guards in a cabin at the top of a mountain in Austria by American soldiers. Information had been obtained about their hideout, and they went to some extreme lengths to hide out. The US soldiers, after hearing the intelligence about Kaltenbrunner's whereabouts, decided to climb up the icy and glacial rock terrain for 6 hours in the complete dark, a rather dangerous feat, to try and apprehend the leader of the RSHA. At the cabin there was a short standoff, but all 4 Nazis were captured without a shot being fired, and upon his arrest Kaltenbrunner claimed he was a doctor and he gave a fake name. However, as he arrived off the mountain and into the local town, his mistress spotted him and called out to him, giving him a hug, and this left to Kaltenbrunner's positive identification. Following his arrest, he was then taken to the Nuremberg Trials, where he was charged with conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. During the beginning of the trial, he was actually absent from proceedings and suffering from 2 subarachnoid hemorrhages, and he took a few weeks to recover. Kaltenbrunner's lawyers did try to get him a pardon due to ill health, but this was refused, and upon his release he was taken straight back to the trial. During his time in Nuremberg, he claimed everything he had done was rubber-stamped and approved by his assistants, and that his signature had been counterfeited by Gestapo chief Heinrich Müller, and he claimed that he did not have any understanding or knowledge of the final solution. He claimed as the head of the RSHA, he was only involved in acts of espionage and intelligence, which were not in fact war crimes. He passed the blame also onto Heinrich Himmler, who had taken his own life, saying he was his superior, and that he even protested against the ill treatment of the Jews to Himmler and Hitler. Expressing complete denial, he was eventually found out, as there was clear documentational evidence about his visit to Mauthausen, and he even claimed that he had tried to end the final solution. It was clear he was talking nonsense, and for his crimes he was sentenced to death, being found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Kaltenbrunner was to be hanged, and spent the last few weeks of his life in prison at Nuremberg. A gallows had been created in the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison, and on the 16th of October the condemned men were executed. There were a number sentenced to death at Nuremberg, the most high profile being Hermann Göring, who actually took his own life prior to the hangman doing it for him. The first to be executed by the infamous US executioner John C. Woods was Joachim von Ribbentrop. Woods's methods of executing the condemned that day have been called into question, especially as a number of those war criminals took a long time to die, one taking 28 minutes, and also the executions were not clean. Many of the condemned were hit on the head by the trapdoor on the way down, and today Woods remains a divisive executioner. After Wilhelm Keitel's execution, Ernst Kaltenbrunner was taken into the execution chamber at 1:52 a.m. He shuffled into the room accompanied by 2 guards and was led up the steps of the gallows. As he arrived at the trapdoors, the executioner asked him for any final words. Kaltenbrunner stated, "I have loved my German people and fatherland with a warm heart. I have done my duty by the laws of my people, and I am sorry my people were led this time by men who were not soldiers, and that crimes were committed of which I had no knowledge." Even as he was about to die, Kaltenbrunner still maintained his innocence. The hood was then placed over his head, and with his final words he wished Germany luck. His execution was one of the swiftest to have taken place that morning, and there were only around 7 minutes from the time he was executed and pronounced dead till the next condemned man, Alfred Rosenberg, plunged to his death. Overall, Ernst Kaltenbrunner was a man who was instrumental in the evils of the Third Reich, and was key to the horrific suffering of many inside the concentration camps and prisons that the Nazis presided over. He was incredibly high up within the Nazi Party, and had the personal respect of Adolf Hitler, and his work presiding over the Gestapo, SD and Kripo was instrumental in Hitler and Himmler implementing their police state. It's important to understand that he was a man who was clearly anti-Semitic, and he was definitely one of the worst villains of the Second World War. Ultimately, he was a man who wanted the Holocaust to be sped up with ruthless efficiency, and for this, at the end of the conflict, he would pay the ultimate price himself.
Alfred Rosenberg was born on the 12th of January 1893 to a wealthy Baltic German family. He was born in modern-day Tallinn, the capital of Estonia. It belonged to the Russian Empire at the time, and his mother had German and French ancestry, and his father was a wealthy merchant. His ethnicity would later be questioned by others, who accused him of having no drop of German blood flowing through his veins. He was even accused of having French, Latvian and Jewish ancestry. But the author of this open letter was later deported, with claims re-emerging inside of the Vatican newspapers. Once he had finished his schooling, he went to university to study architecture and engineering in Riga and in Moscow. However, when the Russian Revolution broke out, he and his family moved to Germany in 1918. They supported the Whites, and when the Reds succeeded and took over control in Russia, they relocated out of their home in Estonia. It's here where Rosenberg really demonstrated an early hatred for communism and all things communist, and he believed that the Jews were responsible for the success of the Reds, as Trotsky was Jewish. He arrived in Munich and began to involve himself in the life of the city. Following the First World War, Munich was a centre of anti-Semitism, hostility and anti-communist feeling within Germany. Rosenberg joined the then German Workers' Party and became one of their earliest members. He joined the party a full 9 months before Adolf Hitler would, and he was also a member of the Fool Society. He was at the time virulently anti-Semitic, and he contributed to his friend Dietrich Eckart's the Völkischer Beobachter, which later became the daily newspaper of the Nazi Party. In 1923, Rosenberg became the newspaper's senior editor, and he printed in his time there anti-Semitic articles and writings, blaming Jews for the German loss of the First World War, and he also criticised the Weimar Republic inside of the publication. Through the newspaper, he was allowed to publish his own beliefs and theories, and it became incredibly notorious for its hardline stance and racial articles. In 1923, with Rosenberg working as an editor still, Hitler attempted to seize control of Munich and become the president of Germany. The beer hall putsch ultimately failed with Hitler's plans for the revolution, and following the revolt, he was thrown into prison for treason, escaping the death penalty. After this, Hitler then placed Rosenberg in charge as the leader of the Nazi movement. He was selected not with regards to his suitability for the position, as Hitler regarded him as weak and lazy. Hitler carefully chose Rosenberg, as he knew he did not want too much power, neither would he be too hungry for it, and when he was released, he would simply hand back over control. Hitler knew Rosenberg was just the face for the meantime, and the Nazi Party had found itself outlawed too, following the putsch, so Rosenberg's power was very minimal. Following Hitler's release, Rosenberg handed over control again, and then returned to journalism and began his major work titled The Myth of the 20th Century, which was published in 1930. The book dealt with key issues and questions around Nazi ideology, including looking at the Jewish question, and it became a bestseller, selling approximately 1 million copies. It was based on the theories of other racial theorists, and talked about the differences between Aryans and Jews, and how they were against each other. He stated how most of Europe's thriving culture was due to descending from German tribes, and he also debated religion inside of the book. He emphasised the importance of Lebensraum and living space for the Germans in the East. However, many of his fellow Nazis found the book hard going. Hitler himself criticised the writing and said it was something nobody could understand, but Rosenberg did influence Hitler. He helped to convince him about the need for revenge following the signing of the Treaty of Versailles on Britain and France, wanting to punish them for the First World War conditions placed upon Germany. He also convinced him that a serious threat to Germany was communism and Bolshevism. Rosenberg was later elected to the German Parliament in 1930, and he began to try and seek a way in which he would become more useful for Hitler. He began to serve as an expert on foreign policy, and after Hitler became Chancellor in 1933, he took over charge of the Nazi Party's Foreign Policy Office. He visited Britain that year to try and build links between the British Empire and the Nazis, but this was a failure. Rosenberg, during an engagement, laid a wreath with a swastika on it on the cenotaph, the war memorial on Whitehall for fallen soldiers. This was then taken by a Labour Party candidate and was slashed and thrown into the River Thames. Rosenberg continued to propagate his racial theories about the Aryan race at the very top of society, and continued to establish it as a master race. But compared to the other members of Hitler's inner circle, it was clear he lacked a lot of experience and authority inside of Hitler's cabinet. He wished for a better job, however was always bested by others as they had more experience in more high-profile roles, for example Göring being involved in the Air Force. This especially was an issue for Rosenberg after the outbreak of the Second World War, as he was not best suited for a militaristic role, and he was seen by others as simply a writer. In 1940, he became the head of the Hochschule, which was a ground for the party's future with regards to continuing and breeding the racist ideologies and theories. Inside of this was a task force set up to loot art and cultural items, and also his group, which carried his name, were involved in stealing art in Paris from Jewish families. Göring used the group to build his own art collection, and Rosenberg also collected the best musical instruments and compositions too. This became the most successful Nazi organisation with regards to stealing and looting art, shipping around 1.5 million railcars full of artwork and goods. After the invasion of the Soviet Union, he became the head of the Reich Ministry for the occupied Eastern Territories. His upbringing in Russia and his anti-communist stance gave him some authority on the Soviet Union, and as the Wehrmacht advances stalled, his influence was rather small. His ministry installed Reich commissioners inside of the occupied regions, and he was given regular updates on what the army was doing. Rosenberg did come into conflict with the SS, as he believed the Slavs were, although not as prominent, were Aryans. He also complained to Hitler and Himmler about how non-Jewish people were being treated in the occupied lands. However, he knew what would come with the mass extermination of the Jews. In a press conference in November 1941, he said, "Some 6 million Jews still live in the East, and this question can only be solved by a biological extermination of the whole of Jewry in Europe. The Jewish question will only be solved for Germany when the last Jew has left German lands, and it will only be solved for Europe where not a single Jew stands on European continents as far as the Urals." He would later claim at the Nuremberg Trials he was ignorant to the Holocaust. However, he could not deny what was said at this meeting, with him stating the need for Jews to be killed on a mass scale. He had no problem in identifying Jewish men, women and children, and also Soviet elite communists for their murders, and the areas under his authority were the first to see the final solution carried out. By the end of 1941, over 500,000 Jews had been exterminated, and it was in his homeland Estonia that was the first to be declared free of Jews. Rosenberg did play a key role in the final solution. He spoke about it, preached it, and in his role overseeing these occupied Soviet lands, he was complicit in the fact it happened on his watch. The SS did carry this out, but Rosenberg did not object, just encouraged. He even sent 2 delegates to the Wannsee Conference to debate the next steps in the killing of the Jews. He remained in his post until the end of the Second World War and was captured by the Allies on the 19th of May 1945 in Flensburg. He was then placed on trial at Nuremberg alongside the other remaining members of Hitler's government to face justice for the crimes of the conflict. He was indicted on 4 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning, initiating and waging wars of aggression, war crimes and crimes against humanity. During his imprisonment, he wrote how that National Socialism was the noblest idea to which a German could devote their strength they had been given, showing he was still a virulent Nazi. The judgment against him placed him as one of the main planners and aggressors of the invasion of the Soviet Union and also Norway, and the stories of his plundering organisation emerged. He was seen as a man responsible for the biggest theft of art, wealth, jewellery and cultural artefacts the world has ever seen. He was seen as responsible for this, and he was also a man responsible for the brutal sights that occurred in Eastern Europe, with atrocities, massacres and mass suffering caused. Because of this, he was sentenced to death and was found guilty of all 4 counts. He was to be executed on the 16th of October 1946 and was one of 11 men to be executed, but only 10 were, as Hermann Göring took his life the night before. He was executed by notorious US executioner John C. Woods, a man who did not perform his office as well as he could have done that day. A number of the executions did not go very well, as the trapdoor was too small, and a few condemned Nazis hit their heads on the door on the way down, meaning that some were bloodied, and also in some cases death took a lot longer than it should have. Some executions took from 14 to 28 minutes, with the condemned slowly strangling to death, as Woods had not calculated the drop correctly, which would have sufficiently snapped their necks. Alfred Rosenberg was the 4th man to be executed that morning, and shortly before 1:59 in the morning, he was led into the execution chamber, where the prison gym had a scaffold built inside of it. He was flanked by guards who confirmed his identity before they took him up the stairs of the scaffold to meet the executioner. Interestingly, Rosenberg was the only one who offered no final words when he was prompted, and as a consequence his final words have just been recorded as just no. The noose was placed around his neck, and he was shuffled over the trapdoor before Woods pulled the lever, and he plunged to his death. Rosenberg's execution most probably went as well as the Nuremberg executions did, as 9 minutes later Hans Frank was also executed, showing that most probably things went swiftly, and there was no blood or injury recorded when he fell through the trapdoor. Alfred Rosenberg is one of those Nazis who helped to spread so much hatred across Europe and Germany, and helped to poison the minds of the public, alongside people such as Julius Streicher and Joseph Goebbels. He was a man who regarded himself as an academic and a skilled author, but he was a man who propagated racist ideas, anti-Semitism and hatred. Because of this, and his role in overseeing much of the Soviet Union, which fell into German occupation, he was sentenced to death. Let's not forget too, that he was possibly the biggest thief of art, cultural artefacts and valuables that the Second World War saw, with his organisation helping fellow Nazis, including Hitler, get their hands on other people's property. Alfred Rosenberg inflicted such misery onto the world. Hans Frank was born into a rather affluent German family. His father was a lawyer, and his early life was rather normal, but at the age of 17 he joined the German army, however never served on the front lines during World War I. Following this conflict he studied law and economics and became a doctor of law, but around 1919 he joined the Fool Society. Initially this was a German study group that gave financial backing to the German Workers' Party, which later became the Nazi Party. He also served in the Freikorps, before in September 1923 he became a member of the SA, Hitler's paramilitary brown shirts. He took part in the beer hall putsch, however following its failure fled to Austria.
Now Hans Frank quickly became favoured by Hitler, and he served as the Nazi Party's lawyer as they rose to prominence, and often he came into conflict with other lawyers. He was a man greatly valued by Hitler. After being elected to the Reichstag, he also became a Reichsleiter as well, the second highest rank in the Nazi Party. He was showered in titles and was very aware of different judicial practices, and he sought to ensure that the Nazis were strong in law. He represented more than 2,400 Nazi legal cases before becoming the Minister of Justice in Bavaria. In September 1939, Frank became the Chief of Administration to Gerd von Rundstedt in the German administration in Poland, which was then occupied by the Nazis. The invasion of Poland was swift and shocking, and Frank was the one who served as the Governor-General of the Polish-occupied territories. Frank began to wield power over the new German lands, and as long as he listened to Hitler's wishes and the Nazi Party's ideologies, then he could do whatever he wanted. He began to use his legal experiences, forcing Jewish citizens inside of Poland into ghettos, and in particular the Warsaw Ghetto, in which terrible suffering occurred. He oversaw the segregation of Jews into these ghettos, and quickly he instigated great discrimination against them. Frank also introduced horrific forced labour for the Polish civilians, who were often worked to death in horrendous conditions with very little food. He was a very powerful man and was responsible for tearing Jews from their homes and sending them to concentration camps. In December 1941, he gave a speech to other officials in his government, outlining how Hitler wanted to annihilate the Jews and that the final solution would soon come. His speech stated how he wanted to liquidate them, and he warned his other officials that they must rid themselves of all feeling of pity. This later would come back to haunt him in his war crimes trial. Frank also oversaw 4 of the 6 death camps found inside the areas of Poland that the general government controlled. He oversaw Belzec, Treblinka, Majdanek and Sobibor. These camps were simply just tasked with mass murder, where there was little labour aspect just to stop, where Jews were offloaded from transports and within minutes killed. He tried to claim he had nothing to do with the extermination efforts, which was a complete lie. He tried to claim that the camps were controlled by the SS and Heinrich Himmler, and that he was a nobody within the administration. However, Hans Frank did fall from favour. By 1942 he was no longer welcome in any position of authority. He had angered Hitler by performing speeches in German cities that opposed Heinrich Himmler and the police forces, and because of this he lost his titles. However, Hitler would not let him resign from his role inside of the regime, and as the Second World War came to an end, he attempted to flee the approaching Red Army. However, he was not on the run for long, and 4 months later was captured by American soldiers in southern Bavaria. He was kept under harsh conditions, and did attempt to take his own life twice. However, he could not escape the fact that he was the butcher of Poland. Hans Frank was then brought to Nuremberg to stand trial, alongside the remaining members of Hitler's Nazi hierarchy, including Hermann Göring and Rudolf Hess. He handed over 43 volumes of his personal diaries to the Allies, which was then used in evidence against him, and he did confess to some of the charges against him. He did state, "I myself have never installed an extermination camp for Jews, or promoted the existence of such camps, but if Hitler personally laid that dreadful responsibility onto his people, then it is my responsibility too." Along with Albert Speer, he did show some remorse and sorrow for his crimes, and also pointed the finger at the Allies and the Soviets for their own war crimes. However, this did very little, and on the 1st of October 1946, he was sentenced to death, being found guilty of crimes against humanity and also war crimes. The death sentences of those found guilty in the Nuremberg Trials were carried out in the gymnasium of Nuremberg Prison by the US Army, and specifically John C. Woods, an executioner who did not perform his task as cleanly as he could have done that day. The executions varied in their length, and some even lasted 28 minutes, and he utilised the standard drop methods, and in some cases the men slowly strangled to death rather than having their necks snapped instantly. On the 16th of October 1946, the day of reckoning came for Hans Frank, and of the 10 executions to occur that day, he was number 5. The executions began at 1:11 a.m, and following the death of Alfred Rosenborg, he was led into the execution chamber. He was flanked by some American guards who confirmed his identity before he was led up the stairs of the gallows. Here he was then handed over to the executioner to carry out the sentence. It was said of his execution, Hans Frank was next in the parade of death. He was the only one of the condemned to enter the chamber with a smile on his countenance, and although nervous and swallowing frequently, this man, who was converted to Catholicism after his arrest, gave the appearance of being relieved at the prospect of atoning for his evil deeds. He replied, answering his name quietly, and when asked for any last words he stated, "I am thankful for the kind treatment during my captivity, and I ask God to accept me with mercy." John C. Woods then placed a hood over his head, along with the noose, before quickly releasing the trapdoor. His time of death was recorded at 2:08 a.m, 9 minutes after the previous defendant had been executed. This shows us that Hans Frank's execution was not as botched as some of the others were that day, inside the early morning, inside the gym of Nuremberg prison. Hans Frank was a despicable man who was responsible for the suffering and deaths of hundreds of thousands of people inside occupied Poland. Despite falling out with Hitler, he was instrumental in the Holocaust and also in consolidating Nazi rule during the early stages of the Second World War. He was a rather brutal man who knew the final solution was going to come, and with the overseeing of the extermination camps, he was a terribly evil person.
Wilhelm Frick was born in March 1877, and he had a rather normal early life, attending school before he went to university and studied law. But then he worked for the Bavarian Civil Service and worked as an attorney for the Munich police. He was considered unfit for service during the First World War, but then following the end of the conflict, he saw the German Revolution of 1918 to 1919, and he was sympathetic to the far right, Freikorps. He was then introduced to Adolf Hitler, and Frick was the one that helped Hitler obtain permission to be able to hold a number of political demonstrations and rallies early on inside of Munich. Frick, after all, was a member of the police, and he was high up in the political department, and he then became a follower of Hitler, and was involved in Hitler's failed attempt to seize power in Munich, the Beer Hall Putsch. Frick was trying to suppress the police's operation, and he was then imprisoned after being found guilty of aiding high treason and helping Hitler, and was given a suspended sentence. But the biggest effect of this was that Wilhelm Frick lost his position in the police, and he was then forced to work other jobs. But then he became an elected member of the Reichstag, and he had been nominated by the far-right National Socialist Freedom Movement. But then when the Nazi Party was re-established following Hitler's release from prison, Frick rejoined the Nazis, and he was one of the first 12 deputies elected to the Reichstag who were Nazi members. Frick continued to rise throughout the ranks of the Nazi Party, and he held a ministerial level post in government, being the first Nazi to do this, and he then used his position to replace officials who were communist and social democrats with Nazis, putting more Nazis in government-paid roles. However, when Hitler was made Chancellor by Paul von Hindenburg, Frick became part of his government as Reich Minister of the Interior. He was the only Reich Minister in Hitler's original government who had a portfolio, and he had more experience than others such as Hermann Göring. But he did not hold too much power at the time, and had no authority over the police to begin with. Germany's police force was being dealt by the local state and not by the main government. But following the Reichstag fire and the Enabling Act of 1933, Wilhelm Frick's power grew significantly. Frick used the fire to Nazify the country, and he drafted many laws around this, and he also drafted the law which banned other political parties, making the Nazi Party the only legal one in Germany. He was also made a Reichsleiter, the second highest political rank in Germany, and he was appointed the Prussian Minister of the Interior, and was given control of the police of Prussia. But Wilhelm Frick also had control over local governments, and he had a lot of influence inside smaller towns, and he was involved heavily in the creation of Nazi racial policies and the laws against the Jews. He implemented many of these policies, including the T4 euthanasia program, which resulted in the executions of dozens of thousands of disabled and mentally ill civilians. It was clear that Hitler trusted and valued Wilhelm Frick, and he was also given a significant amount of responsibility with preparing Germany for a world war. The armaments campaign and rearming the country and building up the military violated the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, established after World War I, but Frick introduced laws regarding conscription, which built up the army to big levels, and he also changed laws conscripting Austrians into the German army, following the Anschluss and the annexation of the country into the Third Reich. He was seen as a key administrator, and someone who could do anything Hitler wished, and as a cabinet minister, he was there for all of the briefings during and before the Second World War. He was also given other roles, for example being an ambassador for various sporting festivals, and he conducted work at many different ceremonies at sporting events, but there was a slight fall from grace for Wilhelm Frick. Hitler's inner circle were constantly jostling for position and for power, and they were always trying to get one over the other in terms of looking more favourably in the eye of Hitler. Previously, Frick had come into conflict with Heinrich Himmler as he tried to limit the use of concentration camps. Frick tried to limit the amount of people who were being sent to camps, such as Dachau, for reasons such as their own protective custody. These prisoners were ultimately enemies of the Nazis, and Frick came into conflict with Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, over this. But Himmler was his great rival, and he came further into conflict with the head of the SS, when Himmler in 1936 was named the chief of the German police, uniting the SS and the police force. Frick would have guessed as a former policeman he would have got this job, but he was passed over for Himmler. Himmler was in a sense Frick's boss, and the police were then relieved of Frick's control, with them being answerable now to Himmler and the SS. The power struggle between the two continued, but Himmler would get the better of Frick again, when Frick was replaced by Himmler as the Reich Minister of the Interior in August 1943. Frick was ultimately sacked, and Himmler was seen as a man who could perform the brutality that Hitler wanted to with the final solution. But Wilhelm Frick would stay part of the cabinet, and he was listed as a Reich Minister without portfolio, meaning he could attend the meetings, but he had little responsibility with the running of the government and also the Second World War. He continued in cabinet until Hitler's death, but his replacement as Minister of the Interior did not make things inside of Nazi Germany more seamless at all. But he was given one last position, as a protector of Bohemia and Moravia. This had previously been held by Reinhard Heydrich, who was referred to as a Butcher of Prague, and he had been assassinated by British SOE-trained Czech resistance officers. But inside of the Czech lands still overseen by the Nazis, Frick continued the brutality, and many resistance members were executed in public on his orders, and the terror inside the lands continued right up until the end of the war, as Prague, the capital city, was one of the final Axis-held cities to fall. He was a man who had proven himself to be a brutal and ruthless commander that would be happy to execute and terrorise the population. However, as the war came to an end, he was arrested. Following his arrest, along with a number of high-ranking Nazis including Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess and other ministers, such as Joachim von Ribbentrop, Wilhelm Frick was indicted at the Nuremberg Trials. Frick was charged with all 4 charges, which were participating in a plan for the accomplishment of crimes against peace, planning, initiating and waging wars of aggression, participating in war crimes and crimes against humanity. He refused to testify on his own behalf like Rudolf Hess, who was considered at the time possibly mad. But Frick was convicted of the charges, and it was highlighted that in his role as Minister of the Interior, that he was responsible for the banning of other political parties, and also the Nuremberg laws that saw hundreds of thousands of people eventually deported to concentration camps, where they were then executed and murdered inside of these camps, such as Auschwitz. Prosecutors proved that he was one of the most senior Nazi figures in the party, behind the establishment and creation of the concentration camp system. For his actions, he was sentenced to death on the 1st of October 1946, and he was to be hanged at Nuremberg prison, alongside the other condemned defendants of the Nuremberg trial. The defendants who were condemned were to be hanged on a large gallows, which was made inside the gymnasium of the prison, and it was controversial executioner John C. Woods who performed the hangings. He was a man who was said to be a poor executioner, with a number of the executions going wrong, and Wilhelm Frick's execution was one which was botched by Woods. He was executed 6th behind Hans Frank. It was said of his execution that the 6th man to leave his prison cell and walk with handcuffed wrists to the death house was 69-year-old Wilhelm Frick. He entered the execution chamber at 2:05 a.m, 6 minutes after Rosenborg had been pronounced dead. He seemed the least ready of any so far and stumbled on the 13th step of the gallows. His only words were, "Long live eternal Germany," before he was hooded and dropped through the trap. However, it's believed that Wilhelm Frick's execution took a significant amount of time and may have taken a number of minutes. The time of death was pronounced at 2:20 a.m, which was 15 minutes after he entered the chamber. However, as the trapdoor was released, Frick smashed into the side of the trapdoor, and his head began to bleed profusely, with a bad wound sustained on the back of his head. After his body was cut down, it was laid on top of his coffin, and images show Frick's remains covered in blood, and his suit, also, that he was wearing had a significant amount of blood smeared all over it. Wilhelm Frick was one of the longest standing members of Hitler's cabinet, and he was a man who was close to Hitler. He was a man who instigated many of the brutal policies and laws that brought great misery across Nazi Germany, but at the end of the war he was considered a man who was to be punished with death for his crimes. But his execution was performed by a botching American hangman, and after his death his remains were cremated and were then scattered in the river Isar, along with the remains of other Nazis who were hanged after the Nuremberg Trial.
Julius Streicher was born on the 12th of February 1885 in Bavaria and was part of a large family, being one of 9 children. His father was a teacher, and later Julius also began a career in education like his father. He married in 1913 in Nuremberg and had 2 sons. In 1914, as Germany was on the edge of the First World War, Streicher joined the army, and during the conflict he was noted for his bravery and outstanding skill on the battlefield, winning the Iron Cross 1st and 2nd class. There were accounts of his poor behaviour in the army, but after World War I he returned home to Nuremberg and returned to teaching. At some point a switch clicked in Streicher's mind that would change the lives of so many. He began to develop incredibly anti-Semitic values, and these could have emerged as he may have blamed the Jews for the loss of the First World War. A wave of anti-Semitism was sweeping post-war Germany, and Streicher helped to propagate this by joining different anti-Semitic groups. They believed that the Jews were the traitors who were trying to impose communism onto the German state, and Streicher continued to join different racist groups. He even went as far as setting up his own regional section of a political party, the DSP, which was close to the Nazi Party in Nuremberg in 1919. The DSP did spread their influence, and Streicher wanted the nationalistic group to become even more anti-Semitic, and it was clear that he had a clear hatred for the Jews and for foreigners. In 1921, Julius Streicher joined the Nazi Party, and with him brought a number of members of the DSP, doubling the supporter numbers of the Nazi Party. He travelled to Munich to hear the man he would go on to idolise, Adolf Hitler, speak, and at that moment he first saw Hitler, he said, "It was on a winter's day in 1922. I sat unknown in a large hall of the Bürgerbrau House. Suspense was in the air. Everyone seemed tense with excitement and anticipation. Then suddenly a shout, 'Hitler is coming!' Thousands of men and women jumped to their feet, as if propelled by a mysterious power. They shouted, 'Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler!' and then he stood on the podium. Then I knew that in this, Adolf Hitler was someone extraordinary. Here was one who could wrestle out the German spirit in the German heart, the power to break the chains of slavery. This man was a messenger sent from heaven at a time where the gates of hell were opening to pull everything down." Streicher's bizarre comments after seeing Hitler speak for the first time stresses his devotion to the man and the Nazi cause, and he describes Hitler as a godly figure or an entity sent to rescue Germany. It's almost like he underwent a religious conversion, but in May 1923 Streicher would go further. He founded Der Stürmer, the Stormer or Attacker, which was a newspaper which would distribute and spread pure anti-Semitic propaganda. From the first issue the rhetoric was incredibly anti-Jewish and brutal, and Streicher even in the early days stated his hatred for the Jews. Der Stürmer quickly became a place where eye-catching and sensationalist headlines attacked the Jews and other minorities. Inside the issues were innuendo, racist cartoons, and made-up tales of murder and other disgusting rhetoric made to do nothing except stir up hatred against the Jews. Streicher was present during the failed beer hall putsch, which shows us even from the start he was at one with Hitler and incredibly devoted. For this he was suspended from his job as a teacher, and Hitler valued Streicher's trust and loyalty, and over the years he would repay him. When Streicher later encountered problems with the hierarchy of the Nazi Party and other senior members, Hitler would always back him. In 1925, when the Nazi Party was legalised and shuffled, Streicher became the Gauleiter of Nordbayern, and he established himself within Nuremberg. He He later became the Gauleiter of Franconia in 1929, presiding over a larger area. Der Stürmer itself began to become a rather popular publication across Germany, and Streicher used it for smear campaigns against other political enemies too, and allegedly even got into trouble for allegations against Hermann Göring, one of his key political enemies within the Nazi Party. Within the newspaper, Streicher insisted Jews had caused a worldwide depression, and it was their fault that Germany was suffering from huge problems with inflation and unemployment. In 1933, he became a member of the Reichstag, and he helped organise a boycott of Jewish businesses. He continued to gain political power and virtually ruled over Nuremberg, and was even referred to as the King of Nuremberg or the Beast of Franconia. He even helped in the desecration of the Bible, claiming that Jewish forgeries had been added to the New Testament. Within Nuremberg, he really did strike down on the Jews, as he ordered the Grand Synagogue to be destroyed during Kristallnacht. He was clearly a virulently anti-Semitic man, who viewed the Jews as a race in Germany that needed banishing and punishing, and he was one of the worst anti-Semites in the whole of the Nazi Party. For this, he often came into conflict with other high-ranking members, and also others deemed his behaviour to be reckless and damaging to the image of the party. Hermann Göring in particular, as mentioned, despised Streicher and banned his staff from reading Der Stürmer. Streicher was charged with spreading lies about Göring, alleging that his daughter was conceived by artificial insemination, and he was also charged with eliciting poor standards of behaviour, such as riding through Nuremberg cracking a bullwhip. He was taken in front of the Supreme Court and was deemed unfit for leadership, and in February 1940 was stripped of his party offices. Hitler remained devoted to him and in contact with Streicher. However, due to his reputation, he could not be seen with the disgraced former newspaper editor. As the Second World War came and went, Streicher lost his wife in 1943, but as the war was lost for the Germans, he considered committing suicide, as he could not bear the shame of defeat on the Third Reich. However, he was captured by a group of American soldiers during the final days of World War II, and after this was placed on trial at Nuremberg. Julius Streicher was one of many high-profile defendants who were placed on trial during the Nuremberg Trials. The city he once proudly oversaw was the city he would be sentenced to death in. Whilst on trial, he was found to have the lowest IQ of the defendants, and although he was not a member of the military, he was seen as a key propagator of the hatred of the Jews, and therefore was involved in the extermination and the spreading of anti-Semitic ideas that had plagued Germany. Evidence presented against Streicher consisted of many of the speeches he had made, and also the articles he had printed in Der Stürmer. Because of these, the prosecutors interpreted Streicher's actions as being accessory to murder and the extermination of the Jews. He was eventually acquitted of the crimes against peace, but found guilty of crimes against humanity, and was sentenced to death on the 1st of October 1946. When his judgment was read, it said, "For his 25 years of speaking, writing and preaching hatred of the Jews, Streicher was widely known as a Jew baiter number one. In his speeches and articles week after week, month after month, he infected the German mind with the virus of anti-Semitism and incited the German people to actively persecute. His incitement to murder and extermination at the time when the Jews in the East were being killed under the most horrible conditions clearly constitutes persecution on political and racial grounds in connection with war crimes and constitutes as a crime against humanity." Streicher's execution was scheduled for the early hours of the 16th of October 1946, along with the other 9 condemned defendants from the Nuremberg trial. Göring, who Streicher hated, managed to escape justice hour before the execution by consuming poison. However, Streicher would face the executioner, John C. Woods. Inside the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison, the United States Army had assembled a gallows, and John C. Woods was the executioner who performed the death sentences. Previously, before Streicher's execution, there had been a number of issues. Using the standard drop method, a number of the defendants' sentences had been carried out and had gone wrong. Some on the way down hit their heads on the side of the drop, and in some cases the trapdoor flew back and hit the defendant square in the head. Also, the drops had not been calculated correctly, and the condemned strangled to death rather than suffer a broken neck, and it took up to 28 minutes for one of the condemned to die. Stryker was the 7th of the 10 defendants hanged that day, and as he entered the execution chamber, he remained incredibly defiant. Stryker entered the room kicking and screaming, and at the bottom of the scaffold he shouted out, "Heil Hitler," in one last defiant statement towards his Führer. As he made his way up to the stairs, he uttered a final anti-Semitic slur to the witnesses, who were there to watch and confirm justice was being carried out. It was noted that as he stood over the trapdoor, and the hood was placed over his head, he said, "Adele, my wife," before defiantly stating to John C. Woods, "The Bolsheviks will hang you one day." Now Stryker's execution did not go as planned. He did not experience a quick and swift death, in which his spinal column would be severed. As the executioner pulled the lever to open the trapdoor, it was said he went down kicking and screaming, and at some point may have dislodged the hangman's knot from its original position. A witness who viewed it stated, "At that instant the trapdoor opened with a loud bang, he went down kicking. When the rope snapped taut, with the body swinging wildly, groans could be heard from within the concealed interior of the scaffold. Finally, the hangman who had descended from the gallows platform lifted the black canvas curtain and went inside. Something happened that put a stop to the groans and brought the rope to a standstill. After it was over, I was not in the mood to ask what he did, but I assume he grabbed the swinging body and pulled it down. We were all of the opinion that Stryker was strangled. So Stryker was strangled to death by John C. Woods after the execution was botched. Julius Stryker was one of the most infamous Nazis, and he was an incredibly disgusting anti-Semite who spread his horrific views across Germany. His goal was to promote hatred towards the Jews, and he did succeed in this, and with his work he gave Germans an excuse to persecute. Der Stürmer itself is one of the most disgusting publications ever written, and also what can't be disputed is that Stryker was very close to Adolf Hitler. His execution was a justified one, and even until his dying minute he was virulently Nazi, screaming his support for Hitler, even as his life was to end seconds later.
Fritz Sauckel was born in October 1894 and he attended the Volksschule and had a normal school life. He did leave school when his mother fell ill, and he then became a sailor, and he visited many different ports around the world whilst he was still a teenager. He then, as the First World War broke out, was on a German ship heading to Australia when he was captured by the French Navy. He was then interned in a prisoner of war camp for 5 years, and when he was released he went back to Germany and worked inside of a factory. However, he then joined a very anti-Semitic group inside Germany, and it was clear he was a very ardently right-wing and racist man. But he then became one of the earliest members of the Nazi Party, and then a member of the SA. He planned a march on Berlin, and recruited 80 followers to join him, but he was then arrested, but as the Nazi Party was outlawed, Sauckel continued to remain active in political circles, and he created his own right-wing organisation. But when the ban on the party was lifted, Sauckel then became the business manager for Gau Thuringia, and he rejoined the party before he was later named the deputy Gauleiter under Arthur Dinter, before Sauckel would then succeed him as the Gauleiter or regional leader. He continued to become involved deeper in the politics of the Nazi Party, and in Germany he became the leader of various Nazi organisations. When Hitler became the Chancellor, he was made the Reich Governor of Thuringia, and he held this job until the Second World War came to an end in Europe. Sauckel was also elected to the Reichstag, and he joined the SS after being invited to do so by Himmler, and he continued to serve and overlook the region of Thuringia. But as the Second World War broke out, he was appointed the Reich Defence Commissioner for a specific area, and it was his role to coordinate civil defence measures and to ensure that rationing was upheld, that the black market was outlawed and punished, and also that the war economy in this area was successful. But then in March 1942, Fritz Sauckel was given a job that would make him incredibly infamous during the Second World War, and this role would secure his execution at the end of the conflict. He became the General Plenipotentiary for Labour Deployment, and Martin Bormann had recommended him for this role. He was working under Hermann Göring and was in charge of allocating labour to go and work in agriculture and also in industry. Göring then made him the leader of this department of labour allocation, and Hitler gave Sauckel huge powers to increase the amount of people working inside factories and in the industries. Sauckel and his officers could issue directives to competent military and civilian authorities to make sure that workers were kept inside of the industries. This meant that as volunteer numbers of workers were not sufficient, Sauckel was in charge of the slave labour programmes, which saw thousands of people killed in different sites, being worked to death. There was a huge forced civilian labour operation introduced quickly. There were 5 million foreign workers brought to Germany, but only a fraction of these volunteered, with the majority being slaves. The majority of these workers came from the east and from Poland and the Soviet Union, where people were rounded up and were at times just stolen off the streets. People were press-ganged to form work detachments back inside Germany, and Sauckel also allowed prisoners of war to be put to work. But these conditions were terrible, and many concentration camp prisoners were also drafted in to conduct back-breaking labour in awful barbaric ways. All of these prisoners were unpaid and were starved to death also, and the rations they were given hardly kept the workers alive. When someone was not fit enough to work, they were just killed or were sent to the gas chambers. The use of forced labour and slave labour increased as the war went on, and it's believed that 12 million workers were forcibly taken to Germany to work under the threat of their life. Sauckel was in charge of this group of workers, and it was his job to get more slave labourers in the factories and on the land. He was then named the Oberpräsident of the government district Erfurt. As the war had turned against the Germans, he was also named the leader of the Volkssturm forces in his region. But Hitler continued to reward him, even gifting Sauckel 250,000 Reichmarks as a gift for his 50th birthday. But as he rallied his troops and people to defend Weimar with their lives, Fritz Sauckel was not willing to do the same, and he then left the city by car. But at the end of the war he was arrested by the American army, and was then interred inside a prisoner of war camp, before he was then brought to the Nuremberg Trials. The Nuremberg Trials sought to try those remaining members of Hitler's government and the Nazi hierarchy who had survived the end of the war, and there were many death sentences handed out by the courtroom. Fritz Sauckel was accused of all 4 of the charges inside the courtroom, including conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning and waging wars of aggression, war crimes and crimes against humanity. Inside of the courtroom, many witnesses came forward about their time inside of the work detachments and the slave labour detachments, but Sauckel claimed he had nothing to do with the exploitation of millions and the suffering they experienced. This was of course nonsense, and he then said he was just following orders, and that supplying labour was just an economic process that needed to happen. He said he was not involved in slave labour, or that it was common to exterminate thousands of people by labour. But there were many documents that showed he was complicit. One was a letter sent from him to Alfred Rosenborg that read, "All the men, prisoners of war and foreign civilian workers must be fed, sheltered and treated in such a way as to exploit them to the highest possible extent at the lowest conceivable degree of expenditure." The defence tried to portray him as a man who was promoting the working class to work together for the German war effort, but Sauckel turned on the other defendants, such as Albert Speer, saying he had a greater blame for the working responsibility of those labourers. But despite this, Fritz Sauckel was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and he was then sentenced to death to be executed inside the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison, along with other defendants such as Hermann Göring. The gallows had been created, and early in the morning of the 16th of October 1946, the executions were to be carried out of those high-profile Nazis. Sauckel was executed 8th out of 10 defendants, and shortly before 2:40 a.m. he was brought into the execution chamber and was led up the stairs. He came face to face with American executioner John C. Woods, who placed a cap and a noose over his head. His execution was then described as, Fritz Sauckel was brought face to face with his doom. Wearing a sweater with no coat and looking wild-eyed, Sauckel proved the most defiant of any except Streicher. Here was a man who put millions into bondage on a scale unknown since the pre-Christian era. Gazing around the room from the gallows platform, he suddenly screamed, "I'm dying innocent. The sentence is wrong. God protect Germany and make Germany great again. Long live Germany. God protect my family." The trap was sprung at 2:26 a.m, and as in the case of Streicher, there was a loud groan under the gallows pit as the noose snapped tightly under the weight of his body. He was then cut down following the execution of Alfred Jodl, who went next, being left for many minutes. Fritz Sauckel was responsible for the deaths of thousands during the Second World War, and his labour policies stole people from their homes and their families, and forced them into conducting back-breaking work on a daily basis. He was one of a number of remaining Nazis who were executed at the end of the Second World War, and he had the blood of many on his hands.
Alfred Josef Ferdinand Jodl was born on the 10th of May 1890 in Bavaria. As a child, it's assumed he had a rather normal family life, and he attended a school in which was linked to the military, and it was clear that Jodl would have a career from this in the army. He was from a rather affluent family, with his uncle being a psychologist at the prestigious University of Vienna, and his younger brother would also go on to become a general in the army. As the First World War broke out, he was pressed into service on the Western Front, serving in a battery unit. He was there at the very start of the conflict, and despite being wounded in action, he was rewarded with the Iron Cross Second Class. Jodl then returned to the front lines, but was transferred in 1917 across to the Eastern Front, and served here, but then returned west. He won the Iron Cross First Class, and following the end of the First World War, he remained within the military. After the Treaty of Versailles was signed, Germany was allowed an army of no more than 100,000 soldiers, greatly minimising the strength and numbers of the army. Alfred Jodl was one of the lucky ones remaining as a soldier in the then labelled Reichswehr, and within this he was a greatly respected and well thought of soldier. Alfred Jodl first saw Adolf Hitler in 1923, when his power was virtually nothing. 3 years earlier, Adolf Hitler had become the Nazi Party's leading public speaker and propagandist, and as time went on, he then increased his stranglehold over the Nazi Party, becoming the leader. It was in 1923 when Hitler attempted to take control of Munich and subsequently be declared the President of Germany in the Munich Beer Hall Putsch. Jodl met Hitler before, and he became attracted to the Nazi ideologies and became a staunch supporter. As the 1920s continued and Hitler was released from prison, Jodl continued to help the group gain support, but he also continued his own rise through the ranks of the military. By 1935, he had risen to the rank of Major General. He met with Hitler before the Second World War broke out, and he must have impressed Hitler with his experience in the battlefield. Because of this, he was initially assigned as a commander of the 344th Division after the Anschluss of Austria, in which Austria was absorbed into the German Empire. After this, Jodl was then picked by Hitler to serve as the Chief of Operations Staff for the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the OKW. The OKW was the High Command of the Armed Forces, and oversaw the Army, Navy and Air Force. As the conflict continued, it had responsibility for the Second World War on all theatres except the fight against the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. Alfred Jodl found himself as a deputy to the chief of the OKW, Wilhelm Keitel, a man regarded by many as a yes-man for Hitler, and also found himself as the Chief of Operations Staff. He gained this job shortly before the invasion of Poland took place, and he was integral to the planning of the war and different invasions and operations, with Hitler seeing him as competent and effective. The OKW ran military operations on the Western Front, in Italy and in North Africa, but there was a degree of fragmentation between other groups, such as the Luftwaffe, who established their own command. The OKW would be led by Keitel, who reported to Hitler himself throughout the whole of World War II. Alfred Jodl acted as a leader and a chief of staff during the invasions of Norway and Denmark, making key strategic decisions in regards to these specific operations. Throughout the war, Jodl was confident about the German army and was convinced that the Germans would defeat Britain during the Battle for Britain, and believed an invasion would then take place. One of the biggest elements facing Jodl at the Nuremberg Trials after the war was the fact he signed 2 military orders which were against the rules of war, were unjust and were criminal. Firstly, Jodl signed the Commissar Order on the 6th of June 1941, just before the outbreak of Operation Barbarossa. This order stated that any Soviet political commissar identified amongst captured enemy soldiers would be executed instantly. This order stated that all prisoners Bolshevised or influenced by Bolshevism should also be killed. Hitler, who gave the order, wished to rid Europe of communism and Bolshevism, the key enemies of Nazism. He knew when he issued this that it was illegal, but said that any soldier who carried out an execution or killing would be absolved by Hitler's Nazi Party and would not be held accountable. It stated that immediate and severe measures must be taken. They are therefore, when captured in battle, as a matter of routine, to be dispatched by firearms, indicating that they should be shot. The Commissar Order also stated that anyone with a red star with a golden hammer or sickle on the sleeves should be killed,
showing the German army how to identify these specific people. Because of the Commissar order, thousands of Soviet soldiers who should have been listed as prisoners of war and treated with certain allowances were shot dead when they should have been placed under custody. The other order Jodl signed was the Commando Order, signed on the 28th of October 1942. This stated that German armed forces should execute and kill all Allied commandos found in Europe and Africa without trial, if they are in uniform or not, and even if they attempt to surrender. This was allegedly issued by the OKW to combat the fact the Allies were allegedly violating the Geneva Convention and that commandos had been ordered to kill German prisoners. The secret order was carried out and said that any commander or officer who refused to carry it out would be punishable under German military law. It resulted in dozens of illegal executions and war crimes. Jodl, signing these orders, virtually signed his own death sentence after the war was over, with both the illegal documents resulting in lots of war crimes. As the conflict continued, he spent time at Wolf's Lair, Hitler's Rastenburg headquarters in East Prussia, and continued to be promoted. During the 20th of July plot to assassinate Hitler, when Klaus von Stauffenberg bombed the Wolf's Lair, Jodl was present in the room when the briefcase bomb went off and was injured, suffering a concussion. As the war turned against the Germans following the Normandy invasion and the Battle of Stalingrad, the enemies of the Nazis pushed the Germans back, and defeat was inevitable for Germany. Hitler, whilst Berlin was crumbling around him, shot himself, but instructions were then carried out, appointing Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor as the President of Germany. It's clear Dönitz must have respected Jodl, as when he formed his government in Flensburg, Jodl was there and was awarded the Knight's Cross by Dönitz. Jodl probably thought that he had a role in restoring Germany after World War II, and he signed the German surrender on the 7th of May 1945 as a representative of Dönitz, and then a week later when Wilhelm Keitel, his superior, was arrested, Jodl became the chief of the OKW, which was basically pointless with the curtains closing on World War II. Jodl was arrested with the rest of the Flensburg government by the British and was taken to a prisoner of war camp before he was brought to Nuremberg to face war crimes trials. Alfred Jodl was accused of conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning, initiating and waging wars of aggression, war crimes and crimes against humanity, all four of the charges. He was seen as a high-ranking member of the military, and the charges brought before him specifically related to the two illegal orders, the Commissar and the Commando orders, that Jodl signed, saying that those who would be regarded as prisoners of war should be just shot when captured. He was also accused of being complicit in other atrocities, and was presented with evidence about mass shootings of Soviet prisoners of war. He said that the only prisoners shot were those who did not want to walk. More evidence emerged with him being accused of being involved in the unlawful deportation of Jews and others, and also in ordering executions and being complicit in these. His signature was found on an order that sent Danish citizens and Jews to concentration camps, and this was also used against him. Jodl pleaded not guilty, however was found guilty of all four of the charges put forward against him. Because of this, he was sentenced to death, and was to be executed in the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison by a botching executioner, John C. Woods. On the 16th of October 1946, these executions were carried out. The Nuremberg executions were noted for not going as straightforwardly as they could have done, as the executioner performed his role poorly. Firstly, the trapdoor was too small, and many who fell through smashed their heads on the side, causing bleeding. Also, John C. Woods did not use the same methods as other executioners, and many executions took a number of minutes for the condemned to be killed, slowly strangling to death. In some cases it took between 14 and 28 minutes for the condemned to die, and John C. Woods was noted for even pulling down on one body as the neck had not been broken, strangling a Nazi to death. Alfred Jodl was the 10th of 11 defendants to be executed, however was executed actually 9th, as Hermann Göring had taken his life the evening before. He was led into the gymnasium and was flanked by US soldiers. Inside the gym was a gallows that had been made to perform the deaths, and Jodl was brought in following Fritz Sauckel's death. He was brought into the room shortly before 10 to 3 a.m. in the morning, and he was led up the stairs of the gallows. He was then handed over to John C. Woods,
who then asked him for any last words, and Jodl stated, "My greetings to you, my Germany." The hood was then placed over his head, and he was shuffled over the trapdoor before the door was released, and Jodl plunged straight through it. Judging by the fact that Arthur Sesenquart was executed 9 minutes after Jodl, we can consider that Jodl's execution was one of the more straightforward ones performed that day, with no bleeding being visible on his body or wounds from the trapdoor. Alfred Jodl was incredibly powerful during World War II and was known for being a prominent member of the Nazi High Command. He was a respected military general and leader, and along with Keitel wished to carry out Hitler's demands to invade different lands and build up a huge empire. It was Jodl himself who signed his own death warrant, being complicit in the signing of the commando and commissar orders, and this evidence could not be denied. When he was brought to Nuremberg, the evidence against him was incredibly damning, and later trials would prove that the commissar order was carried out with brutality. A further trial carried out the year later sentenced a number of Wehrmacht officers to prison time for shooting Red Army soldiers and POWs. Alfred Jodl was a key instrument in the Nazi war effort, and in Hitler's plans to take different lands and inflict such misery and suffering onto people living there. Arthur Sesenquart was born in 1892 inside of a German-speaking Czech town. Within this city there was a rivalry between the Germans and the Czechs, and his parents were well respected in the local area, with his father being a local school principal. His father was Czech and his mother was German, but in 1907 the family moved to Vienna. It was here where Sesenquart studied law, and then as the First World War broke out, he enlisted inside of the Austrian army, and saw service in a number of different countries. He served in the war and was a decorated soldier, but following the end of the conflict, he pursued a career in law. He set up his own practice in 1921 and remained inside of Vienna, but he became involved in the Fatherland Front, a right-wing nationalist group within Austria. Because of his talents as a lawyer, he was invited to join the cabinet of then Chancellor of Austria, Engelbert Dollfuss, but the following year in 1934, Dollfuss was murdered, and then he became a councillor under Kurt Schuschnigg. However, whilst being involved in government, Sesenquart began to study the racial politics of Heinrich Himmler's ideology, and he began to become obsessed in the ideas of Aryan racism theories. He knew that the politics in Austria were becoming more right-wing, but in February 1938 he became the Minister of the Interior. He was given this position after Chancellor Schuschnigg was threatened by Hitler, who was warning him of a German invasion. But Schuschnigg later resigned, and Sesenquart was given the position of the Chancellor of Austria. But the day after this, the German soldiers crossed into Austria, and Sesenquart practically invited them to do so. Hitler then famously rode into Vienna in joyous celebrations, and Hitler absorbed Austria into his Third Reich, beginning a full Anschluss or annexation of the country. Sesenquart later did join the Nazis, but he remained in favour of becoming Hitler's personal representative in Austria. Alongside other high-ranking Nazis, he worked for Hitler and served as an honorary SS member, and then became part of Hitler's cabinet. He became a Reich minister without portfolio, and after this he ordered Jews to be sent to concentration camps, and began to organise this in Austria, as well as the seizing of Jewish property. He later became the deputy to the Governor-General of Poland, Hans Frank, and he was fully behind the persecution of the Jews that occurred inside the country, and he also backed the murder of members of the Polish society. Sesenquart must have been seen at the time as a reliable member of Hitler's inner circle, as he then became the Reich Commissar for the occupied Netherlands in May 1940. Following the invasion, he was involved in creating close ties with Germany and the Netherlands, and using the resources of the conquered nation to help the German war effort. He was mocked by the Dutch, but backed the Dutch NSB, allowing them to make a police force, but as time went on political parties were banned inside the Netherlands, and Sesenquart was the real power within the country, with a direct line to Hitler. He was involved in suppressing the population, and also preventing resistance, and he sanctioned around 1,200 executions of political prisoners and Dutch people who were rising up against the occupiers. Sesenquart was also involved in overseeing the 3 concentration camps within the Netherlands, and in these over 500,000 Dutch people were forced to work for the Germans, and were forced to help the German war effort.
His devotion to the Nazis and his anti-Semitic attitude meant that as soon as he arrived within the Netherlands, he began to organise deportations of Jews to transit camps, and also took measures to force them to wear stars and be persecuted in public. Within the Netherlands there were a number of Jews sent to camps such as Mauthausen and Auschwitz, where they were then sent into the gas chambers. 140,000 Jews were registered in the country, but only 30,000 Dutch Jews lived out the war. But as the Second World War turned against the Germans, following the Normandy landings and the failings at Stalingrad, the Netherlands found itself involved in some of the fiercest fighting there during the Allied advancements. Hitler and the Nazi government tried to adopt a scorched earth policy, or a Nero decree, where docks and harbours and other infrastructure were being destroyed to prevent it falling into Allied hands. Seyss-Inquart did not see the point in this and saw the destruction as a waste of time and resources, but the people in the Netherlands began to suffer greatly. Within the country, there was a significant food shortage which left the population starving. Because of this, he had to negotiate with the Allies to allow them to drop food to people inside of the Netherlands from aircraft to save many of the civilians. But he did not want to surrender and give over the country. As the Soviets advanced into Berlin, Hitler took his own life, and following this his successor Karl Dönitz took the position of president. In this new government, the Flensburg government, Seyss-Inquart replaced Joachim von Ribbentrop as the foreign minister, and this was outlined by Hitler to happen. Hitler respected his Austrian friend and saw him as a valuable asset to liaise with other countries in the months following his death. He stayed in this job until he was arrested on the Elbe Bridge in Hamburg. But after this he was taken in for interrogation by the British and was then later transferred across to Nuremberg prison to be placed on trial in the Nuremberg Trials. Alongside defendants such as Hans Frank, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Rudolf Hess and Hermann Göring, Seyss-Inquart was charged with 4 crimes. These were conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning, initiating and waging wars of aggression, war crimes, and also crimes against humanity. In this trial he stated how he did not know anything about the war crimes he was accused of, which included the deportation of Jews and shootings of prisoners and hostages. He claimed he objected to the deportation of Jews, and the mass evacuations were forced, he said. He denied anything and the fact he was a criminal, saying his conscience was untroubled, and he claimed that he made things better for the Dutch people. This was of course not true with deportations, executions, and the fact the country was starving heavily towards the end of the war. He even accused the Allies of deporting people and resettling Germans after the war, and he stated that, "My last word is a principle which I have always acted and to which I will adhere to in my last breath. I believe in Germany." But Seyss-Inquart was acquitted and found not guilty of 1 crime, and that was a conspiracy charge. But he was found guilty of the other 3, and because of this was sentenced to death for his involvement in the Second World War and the Nazi policies that caused much suffering. It was his brutal suppression of resistors and opponents to the Nazi regime, along with the deportations and atrocities against the Jews in the lands which he was involved in, that sent him to the gallows. It was particularly felt in the Netherlands that his actions warranted him being sentenced to death. When he heard of the death sentence, he stated that death by hanging, "Well, in my view of the whole situation, I never expected anything different. It's all right." Inside the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison, a gallows had been created by US Army soldiers. It was infamous executioner John C. Woods who carried out the executions that morning, on the 16th of October 1946, and he was known for botching a number of them. The trapdoor was too small, it was said, and a number of Nazis hit their heads as they fell through, and some executions took up to 28 minutes to be completed and for one of the defendants to be certified dead. Arthur Seyss-Inquart was the final defendant of the Nuremberg Trials to go to his execution. Shortly after Alfred Jodl was pronounced dead, Seyss-Inquart was brought into the execution chamber, and his identity was confirmed before he was led up to the scaffold. He was led up the steps before he was handed over to John C. Woods. His final words were recorded as, "I hope that this execution is the last act of tragedy of the Second World War, and that the lessons taken from this World War will be that peace and understanding should exist between people. I believe in Germany." He was then shuffled over the trapdoor before a hood was placed over his head, followed by the noose. Quickly Woods then pulled the lever, and Arthur Seyss-Inquart plunged to his death, and his time of death was recorded at 2:59 a.m, 9 minutes after the previous execution. This leads us to believe that his execution went smoothly compared to some of the other condemned defendants. Arthur Seyss-Inquart inflicted a significant degree of suffering in his time serving within Hitler's Third Reich and government. He was trusted by the dictator of Germany with regards to his work towards other countries such as Austria and the Netherlands. But within these countries he caused chaos and sent thousands to their deaths for their defiance against the Nazi occupation. He was also complicit and involved in the Holocaust and involved in the mass murders of dozens of thousands, sending them to their deaths inside of concentration camps. Hermann Göring had a rich history inside of the military during the First World War, but within Hitler's Germany he rose to dizzying heights inside of the Nazi regime. During World War I, Göring was a fighter pilot ace, and he finished the conflict with 22 victories, and he became the commander of the Flying Circus, a fighter detachment. But after the German defeat, he believed that the country had been stabbed in the back. Göring himself joined the Nazi Party in 1922, following watching Hitler speak, and he then became in command of an SA group, but he also hosted many meetings of high-ranking Nazis at his house alongside his wife. Göring was seen as a celebrity within Germany, and he was often with Hitler at huge rallies. Hitler respected Göring a lot, and he was celebrated for his organisation of his SA group, turning them in some senses from a disorganised group to almost a military one. Following the beer hall putsch, Göring, who was shot in the groin, then went on to recover but sustained an addiction to morphine, which he would later return to. When Hitler became Chancellor, Göring rose to power with him, and he was close by Hitler at all times. He was involved in the organisation of the Night of the Long Knives, the purging of the SA by the SS, and Göring was a leading figure behind the Anschluss of Austria to take their natural resources. He was disliked by a number inside of the party, and was regarded as arrogant, but within the German population he was a popular figure. Rudolf Hess, for example, was jealous of his popularity, but as the Second World War broke out, he had a pivotal position inside of Hitler's war effort. His Luftwaffe were involved in the invasion of Poland, which began the conflict, and they were involved in heavy bombing raids which eventually led to not just Poland, but other countries to fall to the Nazis. Following the fall of France, Göring was awarded the Grand Cross of the Iron Cross for his leadership, and he became the Reichsmarschall, making him the most senior figure in the military, and someone that all field marshals were inferior to. He was the highest ranking soldier within Germany, and this lasted until his capture. He was heavily involved in the Battle of Britain, with his Luftwaffe pitted against the RAF, but he was incredibly confident, some would say overconfident, about their chances of winning, but the RAF managed to see off Göring's forces. He was also key to the invasion of the Soviet Union and Operation Barbarossa, and his forces were also involved in bombing campaigns of cities such as Stalingrad. Göring made promises as the conflict turned against the Germans on that front that supplies would be delivered daily to the soldiers, but these rarely came in sufficient supplies. This caused thousands of German soldiers to surrender to the Soviets in cities such as Stalingrad, but his Luftwaffe could not cope as the Allied bombers came towards Germany. Often cities were bombed heavily, with very few Luftwaffe fighters being seen defending the skies over the Third Reich, and ultimately the Allied bombing raids crippled German infrastructure and the war effort. Göring was then blamed for this, and for the fact he could not protect his homeland, and he began to become excluded from Hitler's war briefings, but remained as the head of the Luftwaffe. But it was clear that by late 1944, Hitler did not trust Göring, and compared to the Allied air forces, the Luftwaffe had nothing against them, leaving Göring in a weak position. Hermann Göring was not in the Führer bunker with Hitler, Goebbels and other members of Hitler's government and war effort that stayed in Berlin until the very end. He had been there visiting Hitler on his last birthday on the 20th of April 1945, but then he left to escape Berlin before it was too late. Göring's country hunting lodge, at the time Hall, had been destroyed, and his art treasures were then moved to Berchtesgaden, the mountain retreat of the Nazis, and Göring arrived there on the 22nd of April. He believed he was in a better position to negotiate peace than Hitler was, who was losing his mind inside of the bunker, and Hitler had issued a decree earlier calling Göring his successor. But he did fear being labelled a traitor if he took power, but also was torn between this and not doing anything for Germany. Göring said that Hitler had become incapacitated, and with this he tried to take power from the Führer, fearing that Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary, would do this for himself. Göring asked Hitler to take over as leader, saying he would merely be acting as a deputy, but this message was intercepted by Bormann, who convinced Hitler that Göring was acting treasonous. Hitler sent a reply threatening him with execution if he did not resign from all his roles, and Göring was forced to do so. But within 4 days the Obersalzberg estate was attacked by the Allies, and Göring fled to Mautendorf Castle. He was briefly taken into custody by German officials for his attempted seizure of control of Germany, but was then freed by a passing Luftwaffe detachment. After this, Göring went to the American lines to surrender to them rather than the Soviets, and was captured near to Rastatt. Following this, Göring was sent to a prominent prisoner of war camp in Luxembourg, and he underwent a significant change. He was weaned off a morphine addiction, and was forced to exercise along with being placed on a strict diet, and he lost 60 pounds in weight. Göring was seen to have been very intelligent, and as his war crimes trial approached, he seemed to become even sharper with his change in health. Göring was placed on trial, and was the second highest ranking official tried at Nuremberg, behind Karl Dönitz, Hitler's successor, but he was undoubtedly the most famous of those placed on trial. He was accused of conspiracy, waging wars of aggression, war crimes, which involved the seizure and theft of thousands of pieces of art stolen from other peoples such as Jews, and also was accused of crimes against humanity. The list of accusations against Göring were endless, including the murder of civilians and being complicit in the murder of over 6 million Jews. Göring said he was not guilty, but he was skilled when he was called to testify at Nuremberg. He was seen as a slippery customer at the dock, and despite emphasising his loyalty to Hitler, he claimed he did not know about the concentration camps, and blamed the SS and those such as Heinrich Himmler about the genocide against the Jews. He tried to present himself as a peacemaker and as someone who was simply just involved in the military and the air force, and he gave evasive answers about many questions involving war crimes, but ultimately key evidence had been found against him. He was presented with facts about him stealing property from Jews following pogroms, and also that he must have been informed about the extermination of Hungarian Jews. It was also said how he must have known about the shooting of 50 Allied airmen involved in the Great Escape from Stalag Luft 3. Whilst also in the courtroom, Göring would connote his displeasure and disappointment with the legal proceedings, showing that he disregarded the legal procedure at the trial by shaking his head and also laughing at times. He took notes during the proceedings and also tried to overpower other defendants in conversation during breaks in the trial, and was seen as trying to influence the testimony of others. Because of this, he was forced into solitary confinement, and he also tried to control Rudolf Hess, who was sat next to him at most times during the trial, as Hess's behaviour was erratic, and some claimed he was suffering from many issues at the time. Göring was taken on by Chief Prosecutor Robert H. Jackson, and the battles between the two were fascinating, with both men trying to get the upper hand over each other. But ultimately, during the judgment of Hermann Göring, he was found guilty of all 4 counts of which he was accused, and because of this was sentenced to death. It was said in his judgment, "There is nothing to be said in mitigation," for Göring was often, indeed almost always, the moving force, second only to his leader. He was a leading war aggressor, both as political and as military leader. He was a director of the slave labour programme, and the creator of the oppressive programme against Jews and other races, at home and abroad. All of these crimes he has frankly admitted. On some specific cases there may be a conflict of testimony, but in terms of the broad outline, his own admissions are more sufficiently wide to be conclusive of his guilt. His guilt is unique in its enormity. The record discloses no excuses for this man. But what would have been the expected fate of Hermann Göring should he have been executed? Those defendants sentenced to death after Nuremberg, including Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hans Frank, Wilhelm Keitel and others, were executed on the 16th of October 1946. 10 prominent Nazis were hanged on gallows that had been created inside the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison by US Army soldiers. The method of execution was by standard drop rather than the long drop, and it was infamous and notorious executioner John C. Woods who was the executioner. During the proceedings, Woods botched a number of the executions and had not allegedly calculated correctly the drop needed to kill the men instantly. The result of this was that many of the men executed took a significant time to be killed and be declared dead. For example, some of the proceedings took over 14 minutes and as long as 28 minutes from the moment the lever was pulled for someone to be declared dead. Also, many of the defendants smashed their heads on the trapdoor as they fell through the hole, as the gallows did not allow a big enough drop, and things were much bloodier than they could have been. Woods was even noted to have gone behind the curtain during one execution to pull down on the body to kill one of the Nazis. This is a fate that Göring would have underwent. He was also noted to have been condemned defendant number 1 to be executed first. He would have been the first of the men to be killed that day, but Göring's execution never took place. It's assumed that probably Woods would have bungled his killing, but Göring did not meet his death on the scaffold. On the day of the execution, instead, his body was wheeled into the execution chamber to show the witnesses that Göring had died, but in the hours before, he had taken his own life, having the last laugh against the Allies. Göring, whilst he was alive, did try to change his death sentence and appealed to be shot as a soldier rather than to be hanged as a war criminal. As he arrived at Nuremberg, his uniform had been stripped of their insignia, and because of this he was deemed placed on trial as a criminal and not a soldier. The court refused his request to be shot, and it was confirmed he would be hanged, but outraged about this, Göring wished to have things his own way. 2¼ hours before his execution, guards rushed into Göring's cell and found him dead. Under the watchful eyes of the American guards, he had somehow consumed a capsule of cyanide which had allegedly been hidden inside a Nivea cream tub inside of a bullet. He had crushed this with his teeth, and within moments of him consuming the poison he was dead. The guards regularly checked their prisoners, but Göring's death had slipped their watchful eyes. The question of how he obtained the poison has puzzled historians for decades, and a number of suspects point towards American guards who were friendly to Göring being the ones responsible. One former guard, Herbert Lee Stivers, stated how a German girl he met outside an officers' club said Göring was very sick and how he needed some medicine that she passed to Stivers. The woman, Mona, was never traced, and when Stivers took a note and medicine hidden inside a pen to Göring, he was actually passing across cyanide capsules. Suspicion also fell on US Army Lieutenant Jack G. Wheelis, who was based inside of the prison and was there at the trials. It was considered how, as an officer, he had the power to go and access the private possessions and confiscated artefacts of the prisoners. Wheelis was close with Göring, and the two bonded, and Göring even gave Wheelis his gold watch, pen and cigarette case. But in exchange for this, it's considered that Wheelis could have fetched the cream tub with the hidden cyanide capsule in it. These possessions were not checked as the men were simply guards, so it's assumed that Göring could have came into his incarceration with cyanide on his possession. But after his death, his body was displayed to those witnesses who were there to see the executions of the Nazis. Following the executions, his body along with the other defendants was cremated in Munich, before the ashes were scattered in the Isar River. So Hermann Göring's scheduled execution never took place, but he would have been the first defendant to take the gallows in the Nuremberg executions. He was the most recognised figure placed on trial at Nuremberg, but ultimately he could not deny the mounting evidence against him that he was involved in war crimes and crimes against humanity. He was involved in a huge seizure of property and art from Jewish people and art dealers, and he was also involved closely with the German war effort, especially with regards to the Luftwaffe and the Air Force. The fact Göring escaped the hangman's noose following the Nuremberg trials left a bad taste in the mouth for those prosecutors, as he was seen as one of the key aggressors in the Second World War. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.